Just a few days ago, Russia's foreign minister Sergey Lavrov was on Russian state television, basically warning the West, saying that the use of a nuclear weapon or nuclear war is very the risk is very considerable, given the proxy war that's been going on between the United States, NATO, and Russia at the time over Ukraine. So we wanted to dive into this potential, and we've invited retired Army Colonel Matt Dooley onto the program to talk about this. Good morning to you, sir.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Happy Easter to you.
Happy Easter. It's good to see you guys.
Nuclear war. I'm having flashbacks. I'm just old enough to be at the tail end of the Cold War, and remember having drills at school for what would we do in case of a nuclear blast. All that type of thing. And it seems strange to me. I thought we were past all this, but my kids are going to have to experience a new Cold War. How do you see all of this, Colonel Matt Dooley?
Yeah, it certainly is an echo return of the days of the old big bad Soviet Union. And I'm old enough to remember it as well. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons why I ended up being an armor officer, because I grew up convinced that my generation was going to have to meet the Soviet Guards tank armies in the Fulda Gap in Germany and attempt to stop them and taking over the rest of NATO. And I figured the best way to do that was to take my stand in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in an M1A1 Abrams. And while I was going through West Point the first couple of years, the wall had already come down in '89, but the Soviet Union dissolved while I was at the academy. And so things changed. And for a time, it looked like it was going to be better. I remember seeing counterparts, Russian cadets visiting the academy. And when we encountered each other unexpectedly, suddenly around a corner, a guy grabbed a camera and took a picture of me instead of us shooting each other. And I thought, maybe we were seeing a change in history. And that led to partnerships and working with NATO. And I worked with Russians in Bosnia in 2 tours. And we collaborated and worked together to be peacekeepers or peace enforcers. And so I had thought through the first part of my career that things were going to be different. In 1997, there was a signed agreement between Russia and NATO that seemed to be pointed in that direction. And then Yeltsin handed off the reins to Vladimir Putin, and everything changed. In the last 10 years or so, I've really seen an escalation in isolation of Russia from the West, turning away from NATO, and this idea that it appears that Putin has of resurrecting imperial Russia. To understand him, you've really got to see through the lens of the czars more than anything else. And the old boundaries of the Soviet Union matter to him, and the trauma of the dissolving of the Soviet Union matter to him because he's an old KGB colonel. And so when we look, getting to your point about the threat of use of nuclear weapons, I really see it as tied to a couple of things. One, he's got to reestablish some credibility of Russia on the international stage. And it's easy when you have 6,000 nuclear weapons to threaten that. But realistically, strategically, he's got to convince NATO to try to stay out of this war he's created in Ukraine. And so by threatening the use of nuclear weapons, it's the primary purpose in keeping us from directly intervening.
I find that this situation is incredibly complicated, and it's never been as that straightforward. The more I look into it, the more complicated it seems. Russia would claim that they're just trying to defend Russian citizens who live in Ukraine, similar to how we went to Granada to protect Americans that were going to school there, for instance. I've seen reports of these Russian citizens living in the Ukraine and the Donbas, making claims about what the Azov has been doing to civilians there, and it seems like this is a very muddy water. We now know that we have biolabs funded by the United States and other billionaires around the world, and we all know that Ukraine has been a country that has laundered dirty money from around the world for many, many years. I think most Americans don't want a proxy war, and yet we just decided to raise another $33 billion for this. If you were Putin, wouldn't you want to secure this loose thread on your border?
Yeah, I think what you've got is a valid concern. we'll go through each of the points you made in turn. The Russians have used the reason of having ethnic Russians on the other side of a particular border as an excuse to intervene in Georgia and a couple of breakaway regions in Ukraine. They've also hinted at it in the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, in this small sliver of Moldova called Transnistria. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. So the excuse of reaching across into someone else's sovereign border to intervene militarily on a grand scale, in this case, going after Russian folks on the other side of the border is a common excuse. I look at Putin's motivations, and again, I don't absolve Ukraine for any of its blemishes at all. But I look at what Vladimir Putin is doing as a real test of 21st century civilization. Do we want to permit the violation of someone else's sovereign borders from a nation that really wasn't posing a military threat against Russia, simply because there's some insecurities that he has, or because someone's doing something wrong to Russians on the other side of the border? I think it's a valid question to debate that. Candidly, Ukraine was corrupt in a lot of different areas, but a lot of that region in the world is everywhere. Not that that's an excuse, but you've got to ask yourself the question: being a state that has money laundering problems and corruption, and has some questions of criminality, does that mean that nation deserves to be erased from the face of the earth? My personal opinion is no. I think that we had diplomatic opportunities here to solve this in any other way, and that Putin is wrong for sending in his army to resolve what should have been done, something on the international stage in other ways. And it's cost him tens of thousands of Russian lives.
We're talking with retired Colonel Matt Dooley about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and about the potential use of nuclear war and what looks like yet another proxy war from the United States. And it, like we were saying here, it gets very complicated. And we're up against a break here in just about a minute from now. And there's so much I want to talk to you about here. Vladimir Putin's neighbors are seriously considering entering the NATO pact. Could that trigger a nuclear war?
I think it's definitely a question of escalation. I don't think it'll trigger a nuclear war, but it is a situation caused directly by Putin's actions. If he hadn't invaded Ukraine, he wouldn't have given credibility to the fears of everyone who used to be a Warsaw Pact nation, or who had never been on either one side or the other, specifically Finland and Sweden.
Well,
now they're scared.
They're scared. Yeah, but I think the issue is the whole world is now being threatened with nuclear war, so a retaliation would have to happen, I imagine. So what would need to take place, and in your estimation, before a nuclear weapon would be employed?
Yeah, first, I think direct intervention of U.S. military forces, I think, would be an escalation that would risk changing the Russian calculus. So I think that would be a mistake, particularly since the Ukrainians seem to be doing just fine on their own, unified as a country, supported by munitions and weapons resupplied by the West. I don't think that our direct intervention is necessary. Would it be helpful? Tactically, operationally, yes. Strategically, it would send, I think, a mixed signal to the Russians that I think would be dangerous. And that leads me to my next point. What do you think would cause the Russians to want to use nuclear weapons? Number one, anything that threatens the existence of the regime, anything that threatens the collapse of Russia. Certainly, our use of a nuclear weapon in a first strike would trigger that. Our approach or attack on any one of the Russian nuclear capability triad, their nuclear aircraft subs or their ICBM launch sites. So those are the easy ones to discern. Much harder, I think, to assess is where Vladimir Putin's calculus is. I don't believe he's a rational actor right now in our traditional sense. There's been some speculation that, number one, clearly you can see he's motivated to have a legacy that reestablishes some greater Russia, an imperial Russia. led by him and a few hand-selected oligarchs in his inner circle. But much deeper to that is he may be in poor health, and he's desperate to effect some sort of permanent positive change for Russia before he passes away. There's been some discussion about whether or not he's got cancer, that after May 9th, is he going to go underneath the knife? And so what does that look like as he's under pressure personally to do something significant? Do I think that's going to lead to a nuclear war? No, but I do feel strongly that he's looking at changing the calculus. So what does that mean from a military perspective? I think they may be speculating on whether or not they can use a tactical weapon or chemical munitions to create some sort of breakthrough and operational change on the battlefield inside Ukraine. And so that changes our calculus. What do we do in response? And that's the slippery slope discussion we had during the Cold War. Whoever uses tactical nukes first, then gets tactical nukes in response, which are small, low-yield weapons. And then does that escalate? Does someone take out a strategic target, a city, and then you take out a city in response to that? And then what's enough before both sides recognize, wait a minute, before we deploy mutually assured destruction, perhaps we should go to the negotiation table. So this idea of escalate to de-escalate is what we're trying to figure out right now. Where will the Russians, if they choose to use that kind of weapon, what do we think they would do inside Ukraine, and to what extent? Candidly, I don't believe we're there yet, but it's a good idea to start talking about it. And the one thing that Russia needs to understand, and I think we haven't necessarily been as clear in articulating this, is that, yes, you have nuclear weapons. And for that, the West is not going to threaten and directly attack Russia, but we're going to support the Ukrainians. If you choose to use nuclear weapons, Russia, you should understand that the West has quite a few of them as well. And ours are more accurate and probably better suited to responding to you. So let's not go there. You use it, we'll use it. That message has to be made very clear, because that mutually assured destruction understanding diplomatically is what kept the peace for 50 years and kept us from escalating.
You know, Colonel Dooley, for people who grew up in the Cold War era and then the time immediately after the Cold War era, they had this mentality of understanding of nuclear warfare being a real possibility. For people my age, this is really the first time that this has been a serious thing that people have actually considered. And we have like video games that could talk about this, like the Fallout kind of idea. And so the question becomes like, what exactly would happen if there was a nuclear warfare? And would it actually be more likely at this point, rather than nuclear warfare, than to be some kind of cyber warfare, or even some kind of like EMP kind of weapon being utilized on a major city? And because that alone would cause unbelievable amount of death and damage, considering that everything is run on computers nowadays.
Yeah, that is one concern, the EMP effect and what that would do to our electrical infrastructure for both Russia as well as us, and the long-term damage consequence of that. What are we, 30 days, 90 days, 120 days to repair the damage from that? There is concern about cyber attacks. That's not nuclear, but you can certainly go after infrastructure control with cyber attacks. The one thing we have seen as an outcome of this is that we are, or we're as better prepared, if not better at it than the Russians. They weren't as good with their cyber attacks. And so our combined government capability and commercial capability helped either thwart or shut down some of the Russian efforts. And so that's a good news story. The second thing is that the Russia is hemorrhaging a lot of their intellectual capital. People who are good at this sort of thing are leaving the country. So, perhaps their cyber guys and their tech guys are getting out. So that's not such a bad story. But I am concerned that if we do escalate to infrastructure attacks, what that would result in. It's a good idea, and I'm certainly not advertising to go out and buy a whole bunch of food now, but prepping some sort of 30-day supply of food and water for yourself is never a bad thing.
Yeah, that's so true, and stay in a state of grace. To go back to something you mentioned just a few minutes ago is Russia being not as adequate as the United States to respond this way. But we have also seen a sort of a willingness from China to kind of be involved in what's going on in Ukraine, or to support Russia and economically or financially, what have you. But could China be involved in a strike this way? What do you think about that?
I think a couple of things. They definitely wanted a realignment of the international power control, power sharing alignment. The Chinese clearly don't want the U.S. to be dominant. They want to be dominant. And so they saw a closer relationship with Russia as being beneficial to them. But I don't think in their original calculus prior to February 24th or so, that they believed that Russia was truly going to invade on this kind of scale. And they certainly didn't believe or understand that should something like this happen, they would go as disastrously as it has. The last thing the Chinese want is a global conflagration that consumes them. But they are observing this very carefully, judging the reaction of the U.S. and the reaction of the West at large to this invasion of Ukraine in their calculus to dealing with Taiwan. So both those things are in play. I do believe that the Chinese understand that they've got an ally in Russia, but they weren't prepared to have to support and prop up the Russian economy because they've got their own challenges. And so this extent that they were going to have to bail out their new partner here, I think, is a brutal reality they're now having to contend with. A lot of presumptions strategically by both the Chinese and the Russians turned out to be false, and so they're in a real pickle. And I'm glad I'm not on their decision committees.
Yeah, for sure. What we meant a minute ago, you mentioned Vladimir Putin's health. He's going under surgery coming up in just a few days. And apparently he's turning things over to Nikolai Patrushev, who apparently is the guy who convinced him to make this special military operation happen, which is very concerning. I think a lot of people are concerned. Do you see anything into this character? I don't know a lot about this Nikolai, but is it possible while Vladimir Putin's anesthetized, this person might take extraordinary actions that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, looking at the the history of Russian politics, during the era of Stalin and then some of the intrigue, we're back to that. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. I've got several questions on my mind. Number one, does this guy use this as an opportunity to try to save a little bit of his own face? What kind of conditions for victory does he create so that Russia can declare victory and step away from this? Or is he a madman? I know very little about him other than the fact that this has a lot to do with the fact that he encouraged this and had said we could probably get away with this, Vlad, if we just follow my plan here. He's got a lot of explaining to do. But the outcome also is indicating who might replace Vladimir Putin. Who's the next guy in line should he get to the end of his regime? Is this the guy? Is he the replacement for Putin, as Putin was a replacement for Yeltsin? So there's some interesting information here on this guy. And then the third piece is this the opportunity with Vladimir Putin underneath the knife for them to be an opportunity to get rid of him, peacefully on the table? He just passes away for medical reasons. He's conveniently moved off to the side of history, and Russia sues for peace. All three elements to this are something I'm going to watch for the next couple of weeks very, very closely.
Yeah, maybe we'll get another Tom Clancy novel and movie out of this in the future. Who knows?
Yeah,
but,
definitely.
Real quick, we're down to about a minute left. Do you feel like Russia would use, if they had to, their hypersonic missile technology? And you got about 30 seconds, could that make a game changer for everything?
The hypersonic weapon is just a method of delivery. Because it moves so fast, it's difficult to counter and shoot down. That's really the only significance tactically that it has. A nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. So if they're going to put one on a hypersonic weapon, it just means it gets there quicker. To me, I think the use of it is far more important than the delivery means.
All right, we're out of time. Colonel Matt Dooley, thank you for your input. We appreciate it. God bless you. God love you. Have a great day.
God bless.
All right, that's going to do it for hour number one of Catholic Drive Time.